We are finishing up the book of Philippians this morning, and it's almost bittersweet. I don't want to get out of it. I love it. This has been an incredible series. I went ahead and printed off. If you didn't get a bookmark, there's probably one sitting around somewhere. I think Matt may have some in the back at the info desk. Those little bookmarks basically give the entire outline of where we've been and how the gospel changes everything, and then the different aspects that are changed by the gospel in our lives. And this morning, or last Sunday, we went into a series of texts that we had to split up because Paul talks about two concepts within one. And he starts in verse 10, going really back to what he talked about in the very first chapter, the very first verse of the first chapter, which was the generosity of the Philippian church. But right after he starts that, he goes into explaining how in all things he can be content because of what Christ has done in his life. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look around the section we taught last week, and we're going to look contextually at generosity. Specifically at how the gospel stimulates our generosity. Winston Churchill said this. He said, "We make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give." Basically, the idea is this. You and I, we can make a lot of money. We can get a lot of stuff, but that's not life. That's not what life's about. That's not why we're put on this earth. And the Philippian church had figured that out early on in their ministry with Paul, that their ability to give is much more important than their ability to get. And we see this in life. Even in America, Americans are the most generous country in the world. You can look at all kinds of demographic study and financial studies, and you're going to find that Americans over the last 200 years have been the philanthropists of the world. We give away more of our wealth to countries and to tragedies and situations all over the world. And so we understand this. Give you an illustration of this, on the importance of generosity. Do you guys remember a movie in the early 90s called Schindler's List? I love just saying, those movies that you watch and you can only watch them one time? Like you can't watch them, Passion of the Christ, one time. You watch it more than once and you're just kind of sick, right? So people start to judge you for, why would you watch Jesus die over and over? No. Schindler's List is like that. Hacksaw Ridge, the newest one that came out, that was so powerful. I could watch it once, no more. Well, Schindler's List was like that. And what's crazy about the Schindler's List is when Steven Spielberg, when he made this movie, he wanted to make it, but when he got into it, he didn't. He actually tried to pass it off to many directors to get somebody else to take it because I think the content was too powerful. It's a book. It started as a book called Schindler's Ark. It was written in the 70s or in the 80s. The book was written, and it was picked. And when you watch, the rights were bought to make a movie out of it, and when you watch the film, it's about a guy named Oskar Schindler, and he was a real man. This is what we call historical fiction in the movie terms. He was a real man, and he really did the things that are depicted in the movie. Now, granted, the movie fictionalizes it, but if you go and read about what he did and the way he went about, he didn't start out to be a generous man. He didn't start out to be a hero. He started out as an opportunist. He started out as a guy who was a Nazi who wanted to make a lot of money. He wanted to be wealthy, and he wanted to be seen as important. And what happens over time is as he buys this business during the beginning of right before the Nazis overtake Poland and occupy Poland, he buys this enameling business. He starts to make ammunitions for the Nazis, and in the process, he starts to employ Jews. And as he's employing these Jews, he's got about 1,500 employees in his company. And as he begins to employ these Polish Jews into his industry, he begins to see behind the scenes what's happening to them. And his heart breaks. He gets emotionally involved. And so what he does is he begins to pay for them And he starts to give to them and hire their brothers and hire their sisters. And he starts to bring more and more of these Jewish survivors in. And in the process, in order to keep them in his company, he has to bribe the SS. So he goes and he sells his own property and sells his own things to go on the black market to get things to give to the Nazi SS. And he does this on his own because his heart was broken for these people. And then, as the war's coming to an end, they're getting rid of all. They're basically they're killing all the Jews in Poland, and they're pulling out because the Allies were advancing so deep, and so they were going to shut down his factory and move it. He gave up everything, and he paid for 1,200 Jews to be transported to his new location to keep them alive. And at the end of the war, they finally were liberated, and he had to get out of Dodge because he's a Nazi. And he was penniless. He had sold everything that he could to save these Jews. You wonder what happened to him after the war? When you see the movie, you don't really get to see what happened after the war. You see the end of the movie, and he's crying, this watch could have bought another Jew. This car, you remember that? I'm not making fun. It's pretty emotional, but it is kind of funny. But he's going through, and I'm that kind of guy. Emotional things, I just start joking about them. And he's going through it. I look at this car could have bought somebody else, and this watch could have bought somebody else, and I could have saved more people. You want to know what happened to him after the war? He had nothing. And this group of people known as Schindler's Juden, Schindler's Jews, the men and women he saved and their kids and their kids' kids, you know what they did for him? They supported him. When he was broke, they started giving to him. It was almost like a GoFundMe page for Schindler. And they started supporting him. Do you know that? And most of his life after that, because he was a Nazi, he had to live and move. And ultimately he came back and tried to start another company and stuff. And he ended up most of his life living off the Jews that he had saved, helping him. Isn't that amazing? That's how impactful generosity is, right? Have you ever had somebody do that to you? When you were down, when you were out, when you were in need, when somebody stepped up and served you and gave to you and picked you up? You never forget that. You never forget that. A couple of years, last summer. Was it last summer? Yeah, it was last summer. Beginning of the summer, my wife's air conditioner went out in her car. And all of a sudden, somebody called and said, hey, no, it was Christian Brothers. Christian Brothers called and said, hey, you need to bring your car up here. I didn't even tell Brandon Paffley, I don't think, that the AC was out at the time. He said, heard your AC was out. You need to get your car up here. And it was just paid for by you guys. Some people in this church got together and fixed my wife's AC. Drove it up there, drove it back. You don't forget that. You don't forget stuff like that. Generosity. And this is why I love that he revisits this and almost finishes the book with this concept. That as Christians, we have been given so much. You don't become a Christian without this recognition of what the gospel has done for you, what Jesus has done in giving up his own life that you and I might be transferred from death to life. And when you realize that, you can't help but have this spirit in you of generosity that you want to give back. And it happens in a bunch of different ways. We give money, we serve, we give our time. But it's this concept that I want us to grasp because Paul, he lays on it. He does it in the beginning and he comes back on the end and he hits it again. And so what Churchill would call making a life out of giving, I want you to see what the response is. And this is found in the book of 2 Corinthians, in Luke 6. We've all heard the verse that says, give and it will be given to you, right? It'll be on the screen. We've all heard that verse, give and it will be given to you. I want you to see the context of this verse. Give and it will be given to you. They will pour into your lap a good measure, pressed down and shaken, running over. You know the reason for that is because whenever they would weigh and measure on the balances and the scales, they wouldn't, if they were giving back, they wouldn't try to shake out all the space in the jar or the container that's being measured. They would pour it in and leave it. But no. To shake it down, to press it, means that we're going to try to get as much into the container as possible. Not only is it pressed down and shaken, it's overflowing. This is the response of God to us as givers. Pressed down, shaken together, running over. For by the standard of measure, it will be by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return. See, I believe that we believe this text as Christians. I do. I believe we understand it, but I'll be honest with you. I believe that because of the American way of life, I believe that we don't live this quite as it was intended. There's all kinds of demographic studies on giving. You can see that about 60% of all Americans give something. 66%. Of that 66%, there's a portion that give money. There's a portion that give time. There's a portion that kind of work in political arenas as far as generosity is concerned. But as a whole, as a country, we find that the average amount of giving of any one person who gives is less than 1.5% of everything that they have. Do you know you can go online right now and there is a way to measure. They actually, I think it was Forbes or Money Magazine, I can't remember which one did it, but they created a system for measuring the most generous billionaires in America. And these guys are giving away billions of dollars. And it's amazing. Some of them you look at and you go, their net worth right now is, $20 billion, and they gave away $1 billion. You're like, oh, wow, $1 billion, that's a lot of money. That's amazing. And you look at it, it's what, 5%? That's about 5% of, over a lifetime, by the way, that billion. There was one guy on there, he gave away, I'm butchering it, he gave away some 20-something billion dollars, and his whole goal was to give everything that he had away, and his net worth right now is like $1.5 million. On their little scale, they have like a generosity meter, and he was like 980-something% on the generosity meter, when most of these guys are like 5% on the, 10% on the meter. This guy gave away everything, and he's literally got nothing left. Although if you and I had $1.5 million, we'd be like the talk of the town. But this guy, in the generosity world, he's amazing. You see my point? So I think that we could learn something from the church at Philippians. Now, this is not a giving talk per se. I don't want you to think that I'm up here going to be talking about, the church needs to give more money. No, I believe as Christians, our job is to honor God with our wealth. And that comes in many different forms. So I want us to focus not on just giving to the church, okay? And my elders are shaking their head. Chris, what are you doing? No, I don't want us to focus on giving to the church, okay? I want you to focus on giving to the Lord. You hear the difference? This is not about giving to the church. This is about you and I giving to God. Our time, our effort, our bodies. All of us. All right, so let's look at the text. The first thing we're going to answer is we're going to look at some truths. So as he starts in verse 10, going into this concept of generosity, we have to look at some truths about generosity, okay? This is the first question we're going to ask. What are some truths about generosity? Well, the first one that we need to see is that generosity displays our concerns. When you give to somebody, when you give to something, you don't do it from a heart that's empty. It's never just, I'll give to that, and walk away. No. It comes from a place of concern. We almost always give from a place where our heart has been touched or pricked by God to give. So it starts with a place of concern. Look at the text. Look in verse 10. He says, "But I rejoice in the Lord greatly, that now at last you have revived your concern for me." This word concern is phroneo. Phroneo is a word that we've seen come up 7 different times in Philippians. Do you remember when he says, have this attitude in you, the same as is in Christ Jesus? Be of the same mind. When he's talking about unity, he says the same mind. That's the word phroneo. And it's this concept of feeling or thinking the same. So when you look at your text and he says, you have revived your concern for me, and he says, indeed, you were concerned before, but you lacked opportunity. This concept of concern is this feeling. You had the same mind as me. You saw what I was going through, and you joined me. Your attitude, your mind was the same. We were together. When we give, that's what happens. Our generosity, it displays that there's something about what's going on and we are concerned with. And I want you to see here that this opportunity, it wasn't that they wanted to show, they wanted to give, and they had already given on multiple occasions, right? We know this from the book of Acts. They had already given to him on multiple times. However, now they didn't have an opportunity to show it until this guy named Epaphroditus. Remember Epaphroditus? We've been going through this in this text. Epaphroditus brings it. You got to think, Paul's in prison again. He's away, and now how are they going to get this to him? It actually takes a person to give up their life practically, to travel over months of time to bring something to where Paul is. It's not like Paul being on his journeys before where he passed through and they gave him a gift. No, now there has to be an opportunity created for them to bring this gift. And now they can show their concern because Epaphroditus let go of whatever he was involved in to go do this for Paul. You see how that's put together? Okay, so now when we get through verse 10, after 11, 12, and 13, that was what we talked on last week. That's what we opened up last week when we looked at contentment. Because from this concept of generosity, he says, look, I am well amply supplied. Your gift has done so much for me. And he talks about how he has learned, no matter what the situation, no matter where he's at, whether in abundance or in need, he can be content in Christ, because Christ is the one that supplies for him, right? And so now I want you guys to jump down to verse 14. And we continues the thought that he starts in verse 10. In verse 14, he talks about how generosity engages the need. So not only does it display our concern, but it begins to engage the need. In verse 14, he says, nevertheless, you have done well to share with me in my affliction. Stop right there. Have you ever seen somebody, been a part of something where you saw somebody had a need? Jolene rags on me a lot because of this. I'm not a pull over in the car and help kind of guy. You might be the guy that pulls over and stops everything to help. I don't do that. I don't know why. Jolene will point somebody out in need, and I'm like, they'll be all right. They got a cell phone. There was a lady something happened outside of our, we live just down the street here off of Wind River. And last night we were pulling out with the kids to go for a drive, and as we pull out of our neighborhood, there's a stalled car right there. I mean, it was within 300 feet of my house. Oh, they'll be all right. Boom, and I kept on going. Somebody had stopped to help them. And then when we drove back, they were still there, but they were fine. I'm not that guy that just pulls over and helps. Jolene, on the other hand, is amazing. She was at Walmart the other day. Yeah, I'm telling it. Yep, don't shake your head. Look away. Don't look at my wife. She won't let me say it. She'll never let me do this again. She was at Walmart the other day, and she's pulling out, and I don't know, the one on 380 over here, on the loop, it's hard to get out right there onto Brinker. Well, there's somebody in a wheelchair stuck in the mud. This is not a made-up story. A person in a wheelchair stuck in the mud, and it was like one of those motorized, and they couldn't go. My wife, with the kids in the car, pulls over, gets out, helps them get out of the mud, gets back in her car and drives home. And you want to know what my kids said? They started, when I walked in the door, you can't believe what Mom did. She put our lives at risk. No, they didn't say that. They didn't say that. No, they talked about what she did. And don't you know that my kids, that's going to be seared in their memory of her generosity of serving because she engaged someone's need. I think, I'm not going to kid you, I think most Americans are like me, not like her. I think most of us, and I'm not trying to pick on all of us, but I think most of us, we see needs all around us. They're happening in opportunities placed around us, all opportunities. God's divine opportunities placed around us all the time that we just walk past. Look at the text. It says, nevertheless, you have done well by sharing in my afflictions. This is the ultimate empathy. You guys know the difference between empathy and sympathy? Sympathy is the concept of saying, oh man, I'm so sorry. Man, that really stinks. Empathy is going, oh, I'm so sorry, that really stinks. Here, let me help you. It's the getting in. It's the getting your hands dirty. It's the sharing of the affliction. The word affliction here is also the same word for suffering. It's getting in and I'm going to suffer as you suffer. You see the difference? They're engaging the need. Look at verse 15. You yourselves also know, Philippians, that at the first preaching of the gospel, after I left Macedonia, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but you alone. Go back and read through the book of Acts, starting in chapter 9, all the way to the end. And you'll see as Paul is on these different missionary journeys and all he has to go through. And I want you to think, when he leaves Macedonia in the book of Acts, and this is the church that kept him alive. This is the church that moved him down the road, that kept him going, that were his people that came to his rescue when he was in need. The Philippians. No one but you alone came to me. And look what he says. Verse 16. For even in Thessalonica. Now the reason he says even in Thessalonica is because Thessalonica was a very wealthy church. All right? Even in Thessalonica you sent a gift more than once for my need. He spent a lot of time in Thessalonica, and even more than once they gave. All right, so it's this engaging of the need. Then look at the next verse, verse 17. You're going to see that another truth is that, and this is the part we get but we don't get, that it profits the giver. It profits the giver to give. Now, we kind of understand this. You know, the whole it's better to give than receive concept that we see in Acts. But we kind of get this, but I don't think we really do. Because we are what's known as an instant gratification world. Do you know what I mean by instant gratification? Instant gratification means that it requires zero discipline to achieve, right? It means that whatever I get as a reward happens instantly, all right? Donuts, instant gratification, right? I had a Holy Donuts down the street. They're amazing. That's my little plug for them. Went and got an apple fritter yesterday. The first one I'd had in months. It was amazing. Instant gratification. Losing 20 pounds. Not instant gratification. You see the difference? We are an instant gratification world. We want, we don't want to have to buy something on Amazon because we don't want to have to wait for it to get shipped to us. We would rather just go to the store and get it. That's the kind of people we are. We'd rather pay more money to get it now because we're an instant gratification society. And so therefore giving becomes difficult because giving is not an instant gratification. It is the over time. You're going to see it come back to you. It's like planting seeds. You know, he who sows an abundance will reap abundantly. That's the concept. You got to sow in the spring to reap in the summer. It's months. It's not instant. And that's why I believe we miss this concept. Generosity profits the giver, but because we're so used to getting things now and having it instantly, that we forget this concept. And we'd rather have the instant gratification of what Winston Churchill says, making a living to get, to have. We'd rather have. I'd rather have the instant joy of buying these new things as opposed to the delayed gratification of giving it away. See the difference? And what's crazy is that we read in the Bible, and we're going to see this a lot from this point on in the rest of this text. We're going to see a lot that giving, the amount that you get back, the way God works and has set up the laws, I'm just going to use that term, the laws of giving, works so that the giver profits way more than they gave. Every time. It always works out this way. That's the way God has designed it. And I want you to know, I am not teaching the health, wealth, prosperity doctrine, okay? I am not saying that as a church, if you give, your life's going to be perfect. If you give your money to the church, God is going to make you a happy person. Okay, that's not how this works. But there is something very uniquely connected from the Old Testament through the New that God blesses and gives and rewards the generous over and over and over again. Look at this verse, 17. He says, not that I seek the gift itself. In other words, as he's telling this to the Philippians, as he's finishing up this 4-chapter thank you letter to the Philippian church, as he's finishing it up, he's trying to make sure that they understand that I'm not doing this because I need the gift or that I'm even thinking about the gift. I'm doing this for a different reason. Look, but I seek for the profit which increases to your account. He wants this gift from them. He desires it not because he needs the money, but because of what it's going to do for the Philippian church. You know why we know this? Because this whole book has been about selflessness. Have you noticed that? Starting all the way from chapter 1, well, chapter 2, he just nails it, right? The kenosis, that Christ empties himself. He didn't think being one with God something to be maintained or grasped, right? He's this selfless. He's constantly bringing back selflessness. So we see that Paul's attitude is the same throughout this. It's all about the Philippians, and it's nothing about him. He wanted it for their account. There's going to be a verse on the screen. This is found in Proverbs 11. This is probably mine and Jolene's one of our favorite verses to teach to our kids. We say it all the time to them. We use a little different version. We use the version from the Message. Eugene Peterson kind of phrases it a little differently that I really like. This is the NAS, so it's a little more accurate, but listen to it. It says, there is one who scatters and yet increases all the more. Seems like an oxymoron, right? The concept is the throwing of seeds, right? When you scatter seeds, what happens? They grow. And what do those things do? Make more seeds. It's a beautiful thing about farming, right? It's this concept that there's one who scatters, and yet he gets more and more and more. Not only does he, if you know much about farming, farmers would gather a harvest and they would take a portion of it and they would use as seed crop for the next year. And then they would sell the rest and make a profit off of it. And then they would plant that little piece of seed crop and it would grow. And they would harvest it, have the little seeds left over for the next year, and sell all this and make a profit. That's farming. That's probably in America the only reason people would go into farming, right? There's one that scatters yet increases all the more. And there are those who withhold what is justly due, and yet it results only in want. Think about that. Us who withhold what is justly due. Do you feel like there's anything that you owe someone else? What's justly due from you to someone else? I want to be honest with you. I can't think of anybody but God and Wells Fargo. But God mostly. Right? And yet, I pay Wells Fargo let me back up. My wife pays Wells Fargo on time. All the time. But how many times have I not justly given what is due to God? Right? Keep reading this verse. I love it. He says, the generous man will be prosperous. Isn't that great? What a great promise. The generous man will be prosperous, and he who waters will himself be watered. And he who withholds grain, the people will curse him. But blessings will be on the head of him who sells it. Don't you know in a time of drought, farmers would hoard the grain because they didn't know what was coming while all the people starved? And the idea here is blessed is the farmer who's not worried about his own future, but he's looking at everybody out there, the world, and he's going, I'm going to sell this to you because you need it. I'm going to give it to you. You need it. God will take care of me. And here we start to getting into the next thing. God will take care of me. I want you to think about that for a second, because the next few points, that's where we're going. Look at the next set of verses. So not only does the profit go to the giver, but this pleases the Lord. This concept of giving and being a generous giver, it's a pleasing thing to God. I want you to think about this. If you could make anybody happy at any time, anywhere on this earth, from anybody in your past to anybody in your future, who would you want to make happy? Probably God, right? At any one moment, you'd probably think at any time, I'd love to make God smile. I'd love to make God happy. And what's amazing is the generous make God happy. You ever had a kid who does this? It's one of my favorite things when I see my children be generous, especially with each other. And you can kind of see which kid, moms and dads, you got one kid who's more generous than the rest. You got some kid who's, maybe a taker. They use the other child to get what they want because they know that child is more generous, right? But when they're both, when all of a sudden, out of character almost, they step up and they give something away. I can remember for both of my kids, there have been times when I've actually had to tell them, no, you can't give your bicycle away to the neighbor kid. You ever done that? They're like trying to give away something. No, you can't give away our television to the neighbor. I'm sorry. I know you want to. It's not yours. It's mine. And I don't do that. It's amazing. And what does it do when you see that? You just want to rejoice. Me and Jolene have this thing, we give away tokens to our kids, little gold plastic token things. And you can accumulate, right now it's kind of like our allowance system, because my 9-year-old, what's he going to buy? Well, okay, don't answer that, because he'll probably, I know when he'd buy like a drone and then 1,000 other things. We give away tokens, and you can accumulate those tokens, add up for you to get treats and things and, toys and different stuff. And we give them for attitude. That's the reason you get a token, is for having a certain attitude. And when we see this, we take the bucket. Here you go, son. We dump it out on them because we're so pleased. If you felt that in your heart, you know how God feels when you and I are generous with all we have. Look at this text. I love it. Verse 18. It says, but I have received everything in full. In other words, he's reassuring the Philippian church that Epaphroditus didn't run off with your cash, right? He didn't spend any of it. I've received everything in full. And look, he says, and have an abundance. I am amply supplied. Can I stop you for just a second? This again proves Paul's attitude. Where is Paul? He's in jail. He's under the guard of Caesar, about to go before him at any specific time and possibly lose his life. And what does he say? I'm amply supplied. I have an abundance. I'm good. I received your gift. I got nothing. I don't need anything else in this world. I don't know about you, but if I was in his position, I could think of about 100 other things I could use. Like freedom, like an army to come bust me out, like more friends, more letters of encouragement. We can get real simple, but that's not his attitude, right? Keep reading. I have received from Epaphroditus what you have sent. And notice what he says about it. Look at it. It says, a fragrant aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. He gives the description of their gift as an Old Testament sacrifice. This is the description you find in the Old Testament of those of when the priest would offer up on the altar a sacrifice on behalf of the people to God. And as they would burn the animal, as they would burn the bull, as the flesh would burn, they would the smell of, you ever go down the street, you're driving your neighborhood with the window open and you got somebody's cooking barbecue, you smell the grill burning, you're like, oh man, that's the idea. It's like a pleasing aroma. And you know that someone is sacrificing. In the Old Testament, that aroma would dictate a bull is being laid before the Lord. It smells so good in the tabernacle right now. An acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. Proverbs 3, 9, and 10 says this, honor the Lord with your wealth. Now stop right there for just a second. It's this concept that you and I have been given, and then we're talking more than money here. This is life, right? This isn't just cash flow. This is wealth. We've been given wealth. What's the purpose of it? to honor God. See, it's like a sacrifice. It's like worship. Our generosity, how we live, how we use this stuff that we have on this earth brings Him honor. And the heart of generosity that gives it is well-pleasing to the Lord. It says, honor the Lord with your wealth and from the first of all your produce, so your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. You see a theme now beginning to spiral here? There's this idea now, God's doing something. He's pleased. He's going to give back to you. And that leads us to the last part of this verse, in verse 19. And that our generosity is repaid by Christ. Our generosity is repaid. Let me ask you a question. If you could loan money to anybody, okay? If we're talking investment here, okay? Investments. If you could invest in anything, what's the specific thing you're looking for with an investment? Return on your money, right? What's the return on the investment? When am I going to get this money returned to me? And what's the interest going to be? That's what you're looking for, right? Now, if you could invest in anybody and you knew you were going to get not only 100%, that's not even a risk, right? More than that, that's not even a risk, right? That's not even a risk. If you know you're getting 100% back, that's not a risk. And if you knew you were going to make money on it, that's even better. But what if you knew that this person was Jesus? How would you feel? Now it's a person's character. Now there's no risk whatsoever. There's no risk whatsoever. Look at what happens here in verse 19. It says, and my God will supply all of your needs. What has the Philippian church done for him? They have given out of sacrifice. They have sacrificed, jumped into the pit, shared in his affliction, given to him. And what does he say? What is God going to do? What is the truth that he's trying to reassure them of? My God is going to take care of you because of what you did. He supplies all your needs according to His riches in glory in Christ Jesus. Man, we've got a very wealthy God. He's not wanting anything. He's not in need of anything. And He's quick to repay. It says, and then He worships. Now to our God and Father be glory forever and ever. Amen. 2 Corinthians, Paul explains this to the church at Corinth about giving. And look at what he says in chapter 9, 7 and 8. He says, each one must do just as he has purposed in his heart, not grudgingly, not under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. We've heard this on a bunch, right? God loves a cheerful giver. He doesn't want us to give under compulsion. He doesn't want us to be, feeling roped into giving. And that's why when I start this sermon off by going, this isn't about giving to the church. This is about the heart of the church. The heart of the church. It's not about filling the coffers of the church. It's about the Christian. It's about you and the prophet, as Paul said, that comes to you. Right? He says, but God is able to make all grace abound. So we give, and what's God going to do? He's going to make all grace abound to us so that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good work. No matter how much you give, you're never going to be poor. Anne Frank said this. Remember the diary of Anne Frank, the girl who, the diary was found of her experiences of the Holocaust. Remember that? She said this. She said, no one has ever become poor by giving. It's never happened. If you and I were to probably think of the most generous person that ever lived, human being wise, not Christ, but if we start to think about who are some of the most historically generous people, somebody that just comes to my mind, it might be in yours as well, is Mother Teresa, right? Just a lady who didn't have a home, didn't have a car. Half the time she didn't have shoes. Why? because she just gave them away. Lived with the poorest of poor, ate what the poorest of poor ate. When you think of Mother Teresa, do you think of poverty? Do you think she was poor? In my mind, I think, gosh, she must have been the most wealthy person on the earth. You know? No one has ever become poor by giving. So that begs the next question. So here's just a few truths from the text. Let's step away from this text and look at the reality of the gospel simulates generosity. Well, how does it do that? How does the gospel, what Christ has done by dying on a cross, by raising from the dead, ascending into heaven, sending you and I the Holy Spirit, that we might walk in Him, how does that stimulate us to generosity? There's one answer. It's very simple. It's because He is our provider. When you and I recognize that God is the provider, it changes the game. Do you know that there's nobody on this earth ever existed, I believe, that is a self-made man? You ever use that term? You ever heard that term? My granddad was a self-made man. No, he wasn't. No, he wasn't. Donald Trump is a self-made man. No. No. Name anybody, and we will be able to go back and see how God has allowed, how God has designed, how God has purposed, how God has planned. Think of Job. Was Job a self-made man? Had all this wealth, all these things. God stripped him of everything, his family, his health, everything he had, only to give it back to him in more abundance, right? No, there's not a single person on this earth that's a self-made man, because we, in order to recognize what the gospel has done for us, must realize that God is our provider. And in Him, we have all things. All things come from Him. I'll give you a text. When David was wanted to build God's temple, remember King David? He had the idea of building the first temple to the Lord. That was his idea. But God rejected it. He said, "No, David, you can't do that, because you're a man of blood. You have killed tens of thousands of people, and I don't want my temple to be tarnished by you." Pretty hard words, but he said, "But I'll tell you what I'll do, David, I'll let your son Solomon do it. I'll let Solomon build the temple for me." So you know what David did? David started to take all the things that through the wars and the different campaigns that they had fought through all over the years. He started amassing the wealth and actually having gold and silver and jewels and wood and all the things necessary stockpiled. So that when it came, this was the end of his life. He spent the last part of his life trying to gather all of the material so that when Solomon took over, he could start into it. That's exactly what he did. And when you get to 1 Chronicles, chapter 29, that's exactly what you see. He goes before the Lord and he says, "God, I have all this stuff ready for you." And God says, "Go to the people." And he goes to the people and he shares, "Hey, this is what's about to happen. I'm about to give over my kingdom to Solomon, but we want this temple for the Lord, and we want you to give. We want you to give to God." And so he inspires the nation, and the nation all of the different leaders of the tribes start unloading. They start gathering, and they have this huge store of material and wealth that they just bring up and stockpile for the Lord. And you want to know what happens? David gets a little freaked out by it. He can't believe all that was given. He had given so much because he was king. But then when all of the tribes come together to build this house for the Lord, it's amazing. Look at verse 14. And look at what he says. He's praying. Him and the Lord are having this back and forth kind of conversation. And look what happens. He says, "But who am I?" Stop right there. I just want you to sit on that phrase for a second. Who am I? This is the concept of you are my provider. David doesn't start with, "Well, God, I've made a lot of money in my life. I'm going to let you have a little bit of it." He didn't start there. He starts with humility of recognition. Who am I? Who am I? Who are you? Who are you that you should be blessed by God? Who are you that you should have the house you have, drive what you drive, have the health you have the body you have the skills that you've acquired, in the mind that you've acquired? Who are you? Keep reading with me. Who am I? And who are my people? Don't you know that he's looking around at all the jokers in his country going, where did you guys get all this? Who are you people? That we should be able to offer as generously as this. See, he's looking and he's going, wait a second, we still have to live. We still have to have food and fight any battles that come our way. And yet look at how much they've given so generously. And he's in awe. Look at what he says. For all things come from you. Aha, there it is. And from your hands we have been given. Verse 15. For we are sojourners before you. Notice, this is not this is a metaphor. They aren't physically moving, right? They're in Jerusalem. They have Joshua conquered the land 400 years earlier, right? They're not sojourners, but notice how he depicts himself. We're just sojourners. We're just on this earth for a little while. We're sojourners before you. We're just tenants. You own everything. We're just kind of setting up shop for a little while. We're just subletting this place. As all of our fathers were. Our days on this earth are like a shadow, and there is no hope. Gets kind of depressing. You're like, okay, David, let's lift it up a little bit here. O Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided to build you a house for your holy name, it is from your hands, and all is yours. Do you want to know how the gospel stimulates generosity? It does it when His people, God's people, recognize that there's nothing that you have. There's nothing you possess. There's no gift, no talent, no skill, no knowledge that you have that God has not given and provided. And when we all think like that, guess what? Anything is possible. Generosity abounds in the church. And I'll go one step further. Look at the screen. This is Ephesians 2:5. Look at what Christ did. But God, being rich in mercy, because of His great love with which He loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, He made us alive together with Christ. When we have that mindset, we were dead, and He made us alive. It makes it easy. Not only does it make it easy, it gives us not only opportunity, and it stimulates us to give more and to be generous people. So that's the challenge, right? Can we maintain that mindset? Can we as a church maintain the mindset of everything we have is provided by God? And if we can, what does that mean for this city? What does it mean for the people in your office, in your work, the guys who work underneath you? How is this going to impact your relationship with them, your generosity towards them, your love for them, your engaging their needs and showing them concern? How is that going to enhance the gospel and the opportunities for you and I to share the love of Christ? If the church can do this, I believe there will be a revival like we've never seen in this country.